The recent refusal by Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev to visit Russian President Vladimir Putin has triggered a wave of sharp reactions in Moscow and opened a new chapter in the already complicated relationship between Russia and Azerbaijan. This decision, which at first glance may appear to be a routine diplomatic adjustment, has instead been interpreted by many Russian politicians and analysts as a deliberate political signal, one that reflects deeper shifts in the regional balance of power and Azerbaijan's evolving foreign policy priorities. In Russian political circles, Aliyev's refusal has been viewed as more than a personal or scheduling issue. Several commentators argue that such a move would have been unthinkable just a few years ago, when Baku and Moscow maintained relatively stable and pragmatic ties. At that time, Azerbaijan carefully balanced its relations between Russia, Turkey, and the West, avoiding open gestures that could be seen as confrontational. The current situation, however, suggests that this balance is changing and that Baku feels increasingly confident in asserting a more independent and at times assertive stance toward Moscow. The reaction inside Russia has been swift and in some cases unusually harsh. A number of Russian lawmakers and influential voices in the media have openly called for tough measures against Azerbaijan. These calls range from diplomatic pressure to economic and political tools designed to remind Baku of Russia's importance in the region. Some have suggested revisiting trade agreements, increasing scrutiny of Azerbaijani businesses operating in Russia, or even reassessing cooperation in sensitive areas such as energy transit and regional security. Supporters of a tougher line argue that Azerbaijan is benefiting from Russia's restraint. They claim that Moscow has, for years, taken a cautious approach in the South Caucasus, seeking to avoid unnecessary escalation while maintaining influence. In their view, Aliyev's refusal to visit Putin represents a test of Russia's resolve, and failing to respond firmly could encourage other neighboring states to adopt similar behavior. From this perspective, a strong response is seen not as punishment, but as a signal that Russia still expects respect for established diplomatic norms. At the same time, there are more cautious voices within Russia who warn against overreaction. These analysts point out that Azerbaijan is not only a regional player, but also a strategically important state with close ties to Turkey and growing connections with Western countries. Applying excessive pressure could push Baku further away from Moscow and accelerate its pivot toward alternative partners. They argue that Russia should carefully weigh the long-term consequences of any hard measures, especially at a time when Moscow is already facing complex challenges on multiple geopolitical fronts. From Azerbaijan's perspective, the refusal to visit Putin can be interpreted as part of a broader effort to demonstrate sovereignty and diplomatic independence. In recent years, Baku has emerged from the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh with increased confidence, strengthened military capabilities, and a sense that its regional standing has improved. This new reality may have encouraged Azerbaijani leadership to adopt a more self-assured approach in dealings with major powers, including Russia. Some observers also suggest that Aliyev's decision reflects dissatisfaction with Russia's role in the region, particularly regarding peacekeeping and mediation efforts after the Karabakh conflict. While Moscow positioned itself as a key guarantor of stability, events on the ground and shifting alliances have complicated this role. For Baku, declining a high-profile visit could be a subtle way of signaling that Azerbaijan no longer sees Russia as the sole or even primary arbiter of regional affairs. The broader implications of this diplomatic episode extend beyond bilateral relations. The South Caucasus is a region where the interests of Russia, Turkey, Iran, and Western powers intersect, often in unpredictable ways. Any visible cooling in Russia-Azerbaijan relations has the potential to reshape regional dynamics, influence energy routes, and affect security arrangements. This is why the debate in Moscow has been so intense. and why calls for tough measures have gained traction so quickly. Ultimately, the situation highlights a deeper question: how Russia should adapt its foreign policy to a neighborhood where former partners are becoming more assertive and less willing to automatically align with Moscow's expectations. Whether the Kremlin chooses a hardline response or a more nuanced diplomatic approach will send a powerful message not only to Azerbaijan but to the entire post-Soviet space. As this story continues to unfold, one thing is clear: Aliyev's refusal to visit Putin has already achieved significant political impact. It has exposed tensions that were previously managed behind closed doors and forced both sides to confront uncomfortable realities about their relationship. The next steps taken by Moscow and Baku will determine whether this moment becomes a temporary diplomatic chill or the beginning of a more profound and lasting shift in the balance of power in the South Caucasus. As discussions continue, attention is now turning to how the Kremlin might translate tough rhetoric into concrete policy. Historically, Russia has relied on a combination of diplomatic leverage, economic interdependence, and security arrangements to maintain influence in the South Caucasus. Any move against Azerbaijan would likely follow this familiar pattern, but the current geopolitical climate makes every option more sensitive and potentially more costly than in the past. One possible direction being debated in Moscow is increased diplomatic pressure. This could include a noticeable cooling of high-level contacts, delays in bilateral initiatives, or a more critical tone toward Azerbaijan in official statements and international forums. Such steps would be designed to signal displeasure without immediately escalating into open confrontation. However, critics argue that symbolic gestures alone may not be enough to change Baku's calculations, especially if Azerbaijan believes it has strong backing from other partners. Economic instruments are another area under discussion. Russia remains an important market for Azerbaijani goods and a key transit country for labor and business ties. Tighter regulations, inspections, or administrative barriers could be used to apply pressure. At the same time, these measures carry risks for Russia itself, as they could disrupt trade flows and harm Russian companies with interests in Azerbaijan. This mutual dependence makes economic pressure a double-edged sword, limiting how far either side can realistically go. Security cooperation is perhaps the most delicate and consequential aspect of the relationship. Russia has long played a central role in regional security, including peacekeeping efforts and military coordination. Any adjustment in this sphere would send a powerful message, but it could also undermine stability in a region that remains fragile. Some analysts warn that weakening security coordination could create space for other actors to expand their influence, reducing Russia's role rather than strengthening it. Meanwhile, in Baku, the official response has remained measured and carefully worded. Azerbaijani authorities have avoided direct confrontation, emphasizing their commitment to pragmatic relations with all major powers. This restrained tone suggests that Aliyev's decision was calculated rather than impulsive, aimed at asserting autonomy without completely burning bridges with Moscow. By keeping communication channels open, Azerbaijan appears to be leaving room for de-escalation if circumstances change. International observers are closely watching how Turkey responds to these developments. Ankara is Azerbaijan's closest strategic ally and has significantly increased its influence in the region over the past decade. Any serious deterioration in Russia-Azerbaijan relations could further strengthen Turkey's position in the South Caucasus, something that Russian strategists view with concern. This factor alone may push Moscow toward a more cautious and balanced approach, despite the calls for hard measures. There is also a broader symbolic dimension to this episode. For many in Russia, Aliyev's refusal is seen as part of a wider trend in which neighboring states feel less constrained by Moscow's preferences. This perception fuels debates about whether Russia's traditional tools of influence are losing effectiveness and whether a recalibration of regional strategy is necessary. In this sense, the situation with Azerbaijan is not an isolated incident, but a reflection of deeper structural changes. Looking ahead, much will depend on behind-the-scenes diplomacy. Public statements and media debates may appear confrontational, but crucial decisions are often made quietly through negotiations and informal channels. Both Moscow and Baku have strong incentives to avoid a complete breakdown in relations, given their overlapping interests in trade, security, and regional stability. As the story develops, the key question remains whether this diplomatic standoff will evolve into a lasting rift or serve as a wake-up call for both sides to redefine their relationship on new terms. What is certain is that the refusal to visit has already altered the tone of Russia-Azerbaijan relations, making them more cautious, more transactional, and potentially more unpredictable than before. Another important layer to this unfolding story is how public opinion and media narratives are shaping the responses on both sides. In Russia, state-aligned media and influential commentators have framed Aliyev's refusal as a sign of disrespect and ingratitude, emphasizing moments when Moscow supported Azerbaijan diplomatically or maintained neutrality during critical phases of regional conflict. This narrative is reinforcing calls for a firmer response and creating domestic pressure on Russian leadership to demonstrate strength and consistency in foreign policy. In Azerbaijan, however, the media landscape presents a different picture. Coverage there has largely avoided dramatic language, instead